Good morning and welcome back to Plannercraft. I'm Natalie and today I'm going to be taking you through a little bit of digital doodling. So you'll notice that down the bottom corner of this window I have the chat open, so I should be able to see your comments. So I will wait a few moments while everybody joins. So I'm going to go to New, so that's Command and N or Control and N if you want to use the keyboard shortcut. And you can see that I have all my presets up. Hi Mum! Okay, I'm going to wait for a few more to join. Hi Carol! Hi Jill! Hi Thea! Okay, so for today's project you could work in your usual scan and cut active areas if you want to, but I'm going to show you a little bit of a different way of working. So let's go to print and I'm going to go down to A6. Hi Tony! So you can see our DPI is 300 and I'm going to leave it at that for now in case I decide that I'm going to put in any printed elements. Okay, so if you want to get an A6 artboard up, then we can start to play. And I'm also going to tick the create artboard box. So you should have something that looks like this. Now what I was thinking is it'd be really cool to do something that is a little bit bigger, that's going to build up, so maybe do one a week or one a fortnight depending on how eager everybody is, that we can do in Affinity, and it's going to help develop everybody's vector skills. So this is definitely going to be one that's going to be going into the Drawing with Vectors group 2. Morning Linda. So I'm going to start off by channeling a little bit of Barbara and a little bit of Lou, but especially Lou because I've been doing a few thank you streams this week, and Lou is another one that I'm going to give a little thanks to because she did give us a really good push in the early days. So it used to be so nice to go between the different streams. That was our daily lockdown routine. Okay, so I'm thinking for this first one we're going to do a bit of a sentiment design and then we can start to work outwards from that. So if you have a graphics tablet you may find that easier. If you don't, you can use a mouse with vectors and it shouldn't hinder you too much. If you do use a touchpad, you're probably going to want to invest in a mouse at some point just to save on the old RSI. So we're going to go to our text tool, click onto your artboard, and at this point don't worry about the size or the style or anything, we're just going to focus on a word. So I thought it'd be really cool for our first panel to be Doodle, and it can be kind of the cover for our project. So if we go Doodle, nice and simple. I'm going to click on the arrow tool. We can then resize. So depending on your software, you may find that when you grab a corner and stretch it, it goes out of ratio. If so, just press and hold shift while you're doing that. In Affinity you don't need to. I'm going to go to my font and I'm going to pick a nice font to use. So at this point you don't have to worry about it necessarily being a cuttable font in that sense, so if you want to go for something that's a little bit thinner that you won't usually play with, you can do. So something like that one's quite cool and a bit different for what we usually do. And I'm going to bring that back onto my artboard. So you'll notice with Affinity it gives you loads of smart guides without having to turn them on. So that's going to snap to particular points on your page as well as to other objects. If you're finding that your snap isn't quite working how you expect it to, if you go into View and Snapping Manager, then you can select your options from there. So if I go into mine very quickly, you can see that my screen tolerance is set to 11 and pretty much everything is ticked on for my snapping. So the only ones that I don't have selected are Baseline Grid, which you only use if you're doing lots of text, and Snap to Grid if you have your grid visible and you're working to it. Okay, so I'm going to close that. So with our word, we've got this kind of weird gap here in the middle and another one here, and it looks a bit weird, spaced out. But we can actually start to play with these by actually converting our text to curves. So what I'm going to do is convert to curves. There we go. You can tell I've been using Illustrator for a few days. Hi Sally Ann, I hope you're feeling better this morning. So when we do that convert to curves process, what that's basically doing is it goes back to the font, it looks at the shapes rather than the letters, and it converts the curve to match those shapes. So if you think about it like that, it's bringing those shapes from that font. So it's not tracing what's on screen. Hi Tracy! It's literally going back to that font. So that means that when we are doing something like this where it's joined up text, it isn't welded at this point. So it's still separate. So if you look over here in the layers palette, you can see it's a group, but they're individual elements. Now this does us a favour in some ways because we can go in and we can edit each letter individually and then space them all up. Okay, so that's what we're going to do next. So with our ooh, we need to shorten that tail a bit so it's not quite so long at ooh. So if you select your letter and then go to your node tool, which is A in most software. Okay. I'm going to zoom in so we can see a little bit better. If we press and hold space, it goes to a little hand so we can pan around our map. And there you go, it goes back to a node tool. Hi Deb, don't worry about being late. So I'm going to click and drag a square over this end point first. And we want to try and keep it at that same height. So if we use our arrow keys instead of trying to click and drag, I'm just going to use my left arrow to pull that back. Now at some point it's going to start putting a kink in that curve. Don't be tempted to move the handles just yet. We will sort that in a bit. Because next we're going to work on this next set of nodes down here. And we're going to do the same, so we're going to go left, 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 left. To about there. Now obviously with this node here we haven't got very much room to play with. So we can see we've got a bit of a wobble. So now we need to use our handles of our node to smooth that wobble. Now if you aren't confident with using nodes in this way, you can use the pencil tool with sculpt ticked and do it that way. So you want your handles to be kind of equal distance between the line that they're forming and the handle on both sides, and that means that you get a nice smooth curve. Now, if you're finding that it's snapping and being annoying like this, if you press and hold Alt, you're going to find it's going to ignore that snapping, but you're also only going to be working one handle at a time. So what you want to make sure if you're going to do this is that you're keeping that line going through there as straight as possible. So if you alter one up, then alter the other one down and vice versa. The longer your handles are, the more it's going to follow that line of that curve. So if you think about tighter curves having short handles and looser curves having big long handles. Okay, so I'm going to just tweak these just so that it flows into that curve at the end a little bit better. So hopefully you have something that looks a little bit like that. Now, depending on your particular font, you may find that you need to keep it a bit more regular. So there's a little bit of a wobble here. So it goes a bit too thick here and a little bit too thin here. So we need to fix that next. So again, I'm going to zoom right in so that we can see a little bit better on that curve. So if we click here, we can see this handle comes out this far. If we pull that back, you can see that that line is going to start getting thicker because our curve isn't going to be as loose. Okay. Same here, I'm going to pull that handle back a little bit. Then when I click off it, you can see you've got much more of a smooth curve up into that end point. So now I'm going to go on to my D, and that's got pretty much the same issue. So if we go back to our ooh, and we duplicate it, so that's Command and J in Affinity, we can drag that copy across and line it up so we can see how much our tail of our D needs to alter. So you can see it's quite a big difference that we're going to be making. It's also going to come down lower. So make sure when you're doing this that your baseline for your letters aligns. But try not to worry too much about this bit here aligning, because our curve coming from our O should be sort of along the central line of our lowercase characters, whereas the curve from the D is going to be sitting more on the baseline. And hello Ian. Okay, so to our D, and we're going to do the same again. So we're going to get our end notes, and I've literally pulled that back level. So at the moment you'd be tempted to pull that up to the same height as the O, but don't do it because, like I said, that O is technically sitting on a different line. And then if you were to line it up with that O, it wouldn't be in the right place to flow through the L. Okay, so I'm going to pull that line back there too. Just going to zoom in a little bit so I can see where my next node's going. So we've got this one little random node here, and we can actually just take that out because we're shortening that line. Those two nodes are so close that you may as well just take it out and just deal with the one. Okay, so if we go here, you can see a bit clearer what I mean about the arms of our node wanting to have an equal space, and because we've got this one's more or less flush to that line, and then we've got this big gap here, we just need to tweak it more like that to get a nice curve. And likewise we'll alter our handle so so that it's going to come more this way. Same here, big gap, no gap, so we just want to make sure again that there is a similar amount of gap angle wise between these two handles to that outer path. And again, I'm going to just tweak that handle down there so it flows a bit more. Okay. Now, like before, we've got a bit of a wider point, so we just need to shorten those handles just to make that line flow. Hopefully I still have everybody with me and I haven't confused you all yet. So there's our D. So now that we've done a D, that L is going to end up being pretty similar. But if we look at E, the E actually drops down. So you could almost get away with lowering the tail of that L so it's going to flow into that E. So I'm going to duplicate my D as a guide. Now if you're working in something like Illustrator, you can use a shape as a guide. But here in Affinity, I just put a copy in, and you can always lock if you need to. I'm going to click onto my L, press A to go to my node tool, and this time I'm going to take this to the left. And you can see that this is going to be well out the way of those two nodes that are next in line. And I'm going to take it down to roughly in line of where our E is. And you can see that the end of our L's now gone really weird. Okay, at this point don't panic because you haven't done anything wrong and it's all still there, it's just in slightly the wrong place. So I'm going to take this next set of nodes out altogether. So you can just use backspace and backspace. If you're working in Illustrator, you need to use the remove node option. If you are working in Canvas, click on the node and at the top of the screen there's a little minus button at the top that you can use. So now we can start to actually follow that curve back through. So that we have a nice smooth flowing curve. That's going to fit a little bit better with our E. So now get rid of our guide D, and there's our L. And with the tail on the E, I'm not too bothered. Okay. So at the moment these are all grouped, and it does that automatically when you do your convert to curves. But now that we've done all that editing, we now need to kind of budge it all back up together. So if we ungroup it, so Command Shift G or Control Shift G, then we're going to get our individual characters as objects. We're going to go up to Align, and we're going to go to Align Space, and it's going to go, do you want us to do that automatically? Now if you wanted to keep your D and your E in that place and make sure that the space were equal between the objects between, then you can leave that as auto distribute. But for this one, I'm going to untick it, and it's going to enable you to set a figure. So at the moment that figure is set to 0, and you can see that our tails are touching but not quite over the top of our characters. And that's because that 0 goes to the bounding box of the letter. So if you think about when you click on it with your arrow tool, you get your little squares that go around the outside, and that's showing where your bounding box is. So it's like the container that that shape fits into rather than the shape itself. So to get them to overlap, we need to sort of budge it over a little bit more. So let's go -1 and try that. There we go. So now our tails are overlapping each character. Okay. Then we're going to go and weld it together. And there you go. We've got our first bit of text. So how did you all get on with that? Are you all working along, or are you going to watch back again later and work along with me? Okay. So I'm going to want to start to create a design to go into the background of this piece. That's okay, Tracy. Okay, Carol, you can create along later. And now we might want to pull out elements to actually create a bit of a layered look. So with my text, I'm thinking that I can 3D that up on top and then put some doodle elements underneath. So with the contour tool, which is this funny looking tool up here, or with offset path in Illustrator, or create contour in Corel, and Inkscape has its own version too, we can go and just click and drag that outside. Now at the moment you'll see that it goes, right, okay, here's your offset, and we've lost our curve. Now Affinity Designer is the only program that does this, so it's one of the reasons why I wanted to show it. With the contour tool in Affinity, rather than creating an additional shape, it works on the shape that you are using. So if I go OK and bake that at the moment, you're literally going to get just that outer shape. Oh, Linda. Need some more coffee. So what you need to do, if I step back, I'm going to go edit and do set contour, is you want to duplicate it. So again, that same Command J, Control J to duplicate. So if you're working in any other software, Canvas included, you don't need to do that duplicate. It's just in Affinity. So now I'm going to go to contour, drag it outwards so that we've got a bit of a thicker area. Now what I would say is when we're doing things like contour, just watch your inner spaces in the middle of your letters. So you can take it out bigger so that they're solid if you wish, or we can go a little bit thinner so that we still have nice big holes in the centre. Now I'm ignoring what's going on over here because sometimes it does go a little bit weird, but that's fixable because that path is still there. Okay, but just because we've got these little fiddly bits in this particular O here, I'm going to take it bigger, like so. Okay, then you want to bake it, and what that basically does is rather than it still having that control in the software of it being an offset and editable as such, then baking it literally sets that as curves that your cutter can understand. So I'm going to drag that down to the bottom, and I'm going to give it a different colour so that we can see it nice and easily. So let's go for Let's go CMYK in case we end up printing. Take the black out. Let's go for a nice orange. Okay. So you should have something that looks a bit like this that you can cut out, and that's going to pop up 3D. Not the best description for a process? How do you mean? So basically the contour tool works differently in Affinity to any other software. So I'm trying to straddle that line of using Affinity but also using anything else to create the same project. So if you're working in Canvas, bake. Yeah, I did wonder at the bake. When I try and describe it to people, I tend to say it's a setting in stone because you can't go back from that point in that sense. So like if you were to then go back to the contour tool, it then starts a whole new contour on that process rather than editing what's already there, which can get a little bit messy. So if you do it repeatedly, eventually it will lose a lot of the intricacy from that first shape. So yeah, there would be a better way of putting it, like a finish or yeah, there's loads of ways you could put it. Yeah, set, finish, complete, okay. Even just okay would do. Just to, you know, say that's it, draw a line under it and on. So I want to group those two elements together because obviously if you're working with something that is cut and drawn, then you'd have it grouped. And we'll give it a name, so we'll call it Doodle text. Now with layer names, you will find that some software translates that to Canvas better than others. The most recent updated Canvas, however, seems to have made layer naming very temperamental. That's the word I'm looking for, temperamental. But I do find that naming my layers as I'm going through really does help when I'm going back to a file, you know, 3 months, 4 months down the line, and just wondering what I was thinking when I was creating it. So right now, as we're working on it, we can actually dim that opacity down so that we are just having a guide of that. We can lock it so that we're not going to click on it by accident, and then we can focus on creating our background doodle. So to do this, I'm going to use my pencil tool. The pencil tool is really useful for having that feel of working with a pen. So if you have a graphics tablet, the pencil tool is probably going to be where you feel more comfortable. If you have a mouse, you're going to probably feel more comfortable using the pen tool. Now you can use either tool pretty much interchangeably, but the difference being the pencil tool is freehand, so it literally draws like a pencil, when my graphics tablet will behave. Oh, come on. It's gone to sleep on me. Yeah, reconnect it. There we go. Try again. It's going to die on me today. There we go. So it literally draws as per what you draw on screen. Whereas your pen tool is more click, drag to do a curve or click to do a corner. So you're literally placing the nodes of your design whereas the pencil tool does that kind of placement for you. I had to unplug it and replug it, Carol. It's because the machine didn't get shut down last night. And by the time I realised it was like time to get up, so. Okay, so that you can start to see how we can use the pencil tool a bit better, I'm going to swap how it's actually drawing. So if I click off everything, let's go for this random curve over here. Take the fill out. I'm going to put a stroke on. You can see up here it says none. Make sure it's a solid stroke. And I'm going to put it on about half a point so it's nice and visible. I'm going to zoom in a little bit and go across this way. I'm going to go to my pencil tool. And we can start to actually do a doodle. Okay, so at the moment it's saying use fill is ticked. I'm just going to turn that off because I don't want it filled at this particular time. And you can see that as I'm drawing, I've got this little handle that's going to basically be my smoothing. So what that means is, if I make that a little bit bigger, let's go like this. You can see it's going to go like this, like that, and back round here. And it means that it totally ignores your shaking hand. So if, like me, you have a terrible case of the shakes most of the time, that smoothing is there to get a nice smooth drawing. Still trying my graphics tablet out, but liking it so far much easier to colour with. It is so much easier to colour with, but even for doing things like your vector work, it can be such a pleasure to work with. Okay, so this is your first kind of smoothing where we're using this arm. Our second uses a window, so it will literally look at what you draw and then smooth it after. A bit like the shape tool in Illustrator, in that it will work out what you were trying to draw from the squiggle that you put on screen. Okay. Now obviously when you're drawing with a pencil tool, you may find that you get lines that don't quite close. Don't worry at this point about that. You just try and rough in what is going where. So I'm going to take out that top leaf and do it again, because it's not in the right place at all. And this one's way too big, because I was trying to show you the handle. So I'm going to go back to my pencil tool, and we're going to pop another one in there, and another one in there, and then we might do something on this end point here. So we've got the shape tools, and we click and drag the shape tools so that we form a oval or a circle, like so. And I think I am going to go for, let's go circle. So if you press and hold shift, you're going to get a circle. I'm going to drag it out this way a little. I'm going to duplicate it. I'm going to go to my offset and drag that outwards, like so. I'm going to bake it. Go to my stroke, go to dash, and then you have the first figure is the actual dash itself, and the second is the gap between. So if I set that to 6, you can see that you're going to get a much bigger gap between dots. So if I make these dots a little bit bigger so you can see them, there we go. Now with affinity, you can set that first dash to 0, and it's going to create a circle for a dot when you have the rounded cap on your stroke. Okay, if you're working in Illustrator, you will need to set that to 0.25. Okay, and I'm going to drop down my gap a little bit so we get a few more dots. So let's go to 3. There we go. Now what phase does is it moves those dots around that circle to a point where you're happy. So if you think back to the stitch nesting shapes, for instance, all those lovely dashes line up precisely all the way around the outside and you've got perfect placement for the corners. That's all done using phase in Affinity. Okay, so I'm going to click off that. And we can go back to using our pen tool from there if you want to go back and use the pencil tool. So for those of you that have a mouse, let's do a little bit with the pen tool. So again, I'm going to go from my doodle. I'm going to overlap slightly. Click and drag is going to do this lovely curve with these handles for the nodes. And if we just click, it's going to do a corner. Okay, so I'm just going to delete that last one. So there's our next stem. And to finish that off, I'm going to go to my arrow tool, click off, then go back to my pen tool, ready for my next shape. And this time I'm going to go and do a click to start, click and drag to do the side, and click for the tip, click drag for the other side, and click to close. Okay, and we can set that to a solid line if we want to. And we'll do the same here. And we'll do the same just there. Now what I love about vector rather than bitmap is at any point we can go back into that shape and we can edit it to do whatever we want it to. Whereas with bitmap you kind of fix to your brush strokes, so you end up having to erase and back into it and maybe redoing that stroke. With vector it's just a case of move a few nodes and ta-da! So it's one of the reasons why once you get into doing things like vector brushes, which you would do with the brush tool, you'll find it so much easier to do things like the colouring because you can move where that brush stroke goes by changing the path. So let's go for a different shape this time, and I'm going to go for a cloud tool. And again we can press and hold shift. And we can change our number of bubbles as they've called it. I'm going to go for odd numbers, just tends to work better that way. And pop that like so. And I can even take elements from the other little flower that we have and copy that across. Okay, so now let's fix our little leaves from our first one. So now that we've got kind of a style developing, and we're going to go to our node tool, and we can just drag that back. Now if you look here you can see that it comes up with a little yellow line through the path that it's snapping to, and that's really useful for knowing that we're lining up our points exactly so that they are finishing at just the right point. Okay. Now once you've done that shape, you can actually close it this at the moment, you can see that it's automatically closed because we've overlapped. If you find that it hasn't, which that one has, that's good. If you haven't quite got them overlapped enough to close, you just use this little button here. I'm too good, that's the problem. Okay, so just get those back there. There's a bit of a kick on that one, so I'm just going to remove those nodes that we don't need so that we can overlap these two nicely. And same here, and move that one there. So I'm just going to move that way so that it has a bit more of a gentle curve in it. Anywhere that's got a bit of a kink, you might want to just enlarge the handle, because that tends to smooth out any kinking that you have in your path, so that it's a bit smoother. Okay. Now, given that the word's doodle, it would be nice to put some little squiggles in that, and maybe some shapes that we can actually use to make a bigger background as a whole. So before I go too far, I want to group these shapes so that I can create other shapes on top without losing them in all this madness that is the layers palette. So I'm going to go to my arrow tool. I'm going to click and drag over the top, and that's going to select everything that is wholly within that box. I can then press and hold shift and just click on that stem. Control and G or Command and G to group it. Again, click and drag over the top, and we can go and group. Now when we're grouping shapes like that, you'll notice that some of the layers were above the first group, some of them were below. As soon as we do that group, it's going to ignore all of that and pop it into one place. So that's something to bear in mind if you try to do something a bit clever, like a chain for instance, where you've got half of it coming over the top and half of it's going underneath. If you then group it, it's all going to come back to one layer. Okay. So before I go and put in a load of other flowers in here, I'm thinking it'd be really nice to do something in this background. So I'm going to zoom out and let's put in some nice areas of shapes that we can play with. So I'm going to go for a circle tool first of all. I'm going to click and drag and press and hold shift, and I'm going to take it so it's about that big, and I'm going to let it go off the page. So never be afraid of letting shapes go off the edge of your page, because we can always come back and trim them if need be. Next, to help me, I'm going to put some guides in. And this is so I can kind of work with my layout before having to commit to actually putting in paths. So I'm thinking it'd be really funky to do something like this. And then maybe another circle that's going to come this way. And maybe even part of a circle. So let's go for the pie tool. I'm going to click and drag, press and hold shift. And while our tool is still selected, you can see that there are 3 red dots. So if I zoom in a bit more so you can see those a little bit clearer. So you've got a red dot here, one here, and one here. These control how your shape works. So for instance, this little dot here in the middle, that controls whether you want it more of a donut shape or if you just want it as a pie. And all I'm doing to change that is just dragging it along this red line that comes up when we click on that node. So you'll see the rest of the time it just disappears. But as soon as you hover over the top of it, it's going to come up to let you know which way it's going to move. And we can change that. Now for our top point, again we've got another red dot, and that's going to change our start point, and the other one's going to change our end point. So if we just want to use a right angle of it, we can do. So again, I'm going to move that so it meets our guides, and we can resize that outwards. Okay, and again I've taken that off the side. So when we're working with panels, it's always a good idea to try and extend things beyond that edge. It's always going to look more professional in that way. So if you think about inkjet printing, and I think that's where it kind of comes from in our heads actually, inkjet printing can't go to the edges, or at least it couldn't do up until early 2000s. Even then it's hit and miss. And your brain, I don't know if it's just me coming from a graphics background, I see these things that, you know, stay within the borders, and I just think, yeah, you've had that printed cheaply. Whereas if something goes off the edge, I tend to think, yeah, that's a bit more finished, polished. So I tend to make sure that everything that I'm doing, where I'm stamping a background, or if I'm working with pattern paper, I try to make sure it goes off the edges. So we've got our first bit of our structure in here, and I still want to use some of these lines. So we might want to use this section in here. We might then continue a border out this way. In actual fact, I'm going to do that just so you can see how we can trace. So I'm going to come in here with the pen tool. Now tracing is always easier with the pen tool rather than the pencil tool. Especially if you've got something geometric like this, because you can just go click, click, click in each of the corners. The interesting bit is when we get to a curve. Okay, so if we hover over this line, you can see we've got our little yellow line again. So that's making sure that our node is staying on that same curve. So we can click, we can drag, and notice if we go up to more or less the end point, is going to stay on that line without kicking out too much. So I'm going to go like that and close it. Okay. Now with regards to placement for this node here, that is something you're going to develop with practice. So this is something I said on the group earlier. Repetition is the best way of learning, especially with vectors, because the more you train that relationship between the handles and the path into your head, the easier it's going to be for you to draw and create with them. And it is just a case of grabbing anything that you can trace and working around the outside. So if it's a photograph of a kettle, if it's a drawing that you've done, if there's a silhouette you've seen that you want to try and trace around the outside, just so that you are practicing that relationship. So not necessarily to use them for anything, but just to practice that skill of where do I place that next node, how far do I drag out the handles. Then that process really does help your it's almost like muscle memories for drawers. You know, that you kind of building up that relationship in your head. Okay, so that's our next shape. And now I'm going to do a little border. And let's go for a dash. Going to take it a little bit bigger. So going back to dashes and phasing, you can see that our starting point was just here, and that's why I dot centres on that point. Now you may not necessarily want that point to be there, so you've got two options. You can move that node, or you can use the phase. Now most of the time the quickest way is to just move that node, especially on a straight path like this. But if you're working with something a bit more curved, then what you're going to want to do is to use that phase instead. So I'm going to look at that and try and get this gap here equal to this gap here, so it looks right. So how are you all doing? Next, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, okay, we've got this circle here, and at the moment that is still a solid circle. We've got this section here, which is still solid. What if we want to take that out, that centre hole in the middle? Because obviously that's not the same as if it was going to this centre point of this circle down here. So what you need to do is select that circle, select the pie, and then go to divide. So that's this end one here, and that punches everything through everything else. And you can see here that we've gone from having two shapes to having three shapes. And that's because we've got this little shape here in the middle. It's still a shape, so we can take that out. Then we can set our fill in this shape to another colour. So let's go to maybe not quite such a violent yellow. Let's go a little bit paler. There we go. And bear in mind we're going to want to push these to the back in a minute. And let's go for something a little warmer. For this one. And again, I'm going to get rid of that stroke from the outside so that we have a spot of colour. And we can send those to the back. So to do that is Command, Shift and open square bracket. So put your finger on Command first, then onto Shift. While holding those, you're going to tap the open square bracket, and that's going to push everything to the back that is currently selected. Okay. Now I'm thinking for this piece here, I'm going to leave it separate, but I will give it a colour just so I can visually see that it's different. So if we go into our fill, we're going to set everything to 0 so that it's white. And we can even pop that into our Doodle text group so that we know that it's going to be cut separate. Now obviously at the moment that group is muted in terms of having that low opacity, so that it's just a guide, but we can still see it's there. And it would still export as well, which is the other important thing to mention. So let's grab our original flower groups, and again we can go Command J to duplicate, and we can pop these over here. So again, if snapping is being annoying, press and hold Alt and it's going to ignore it. And again, press and hold Alt. We can actually drag out a copy. So the important thing with that is when you're pressing Alt. So if you've already picked this up and you're dragging it around, then when you press Alt, it's going to ignore that snapping. If you press Alt first, so if I do it to this one down here, so I've pressed and I'm holding Alt, I click and I drag, you're going to get a duplicate. So if you're finding that Command J won't work for you for whatever reason, maybe that it's not available in your software, chances are if you press and hold Alt, click and drag your shape, you'll bring out a duplicate. So you can always do it that way. So I'm going to bring this up here so that we start to fill up the space here. And we could do with another little flower in there that's going to be slightly different. So I'm going to go for let's go for the square star tool. I'm going to press and hold Shift, so that's going to constrain it so it's equal. I'm going to let go, and you can see at the moment it's got that fill of white. I'm just going to pop black around the outside. It's going to pick up our dotted strokes from before, so I'm going to go to a solid and lower it down. Okay. And with our shape tool we can change that inner radius like so. So I'm going to take it to there, which is the sort of outer snap point. I'm going to go to Layer, Convert to Curves. So that's changing it from a shape to a curve. So rather than being able to now alter that centre point, we can now alter all the rest of it individually if we need to. So I'm going to select all these points around the outside, like so. And I'm going to go to the corner rounder tool, which is the one underneath the contour tool. I'm going to select one of the points that is blue, and I'm going to click and drag inwards. So in Illustrator, you basically do this with the little blue dot that appears in corner points. And I'm going to literally do it so that our two circles don't quite go all the way to overlapping, because otherwise you may as well use the cloud tool. But I'm going to go to about there. So if I click off, you can see there's the start of a nice flower. And now what I would do is I'm just going to rotate that round so that we can have it coming a bit more this way. Now with this flower here we've got our dotted line that we used before, so I'm going to go grab a circle, press and hold Shift to draw it, go for my dotted line, increase the size of my dots a little bit, not that much, and this time I'm going to lower my gap so it's going to be a bit more dense. I'm going to use my keyboard keys to bring that more central, like so. Press P for the pen tool, and I'm literally going to click at the first point and then come down just inside our orange area of our text. And I'm going to click and drag. Now bear in mind, if you kick that out that way, it's going to look a bit weird because your stem should be connected into the centre of your flower. So you want to just bring it back so it's a bit more like that. Okay. So again, you can see if I zoom, that where we've got our path, it's done that first dot right smack on that flower, so we can use phase to shift that. There you go. So with that all done, I'm going to change my opacity back on my doodle. I'm going to bring it up to the top as well because that's going to be sticking on top anyway. So that's Command, Shift and close square bracket this time to bring it up to the top. Hi Sarah Lou! I don't know, these naughty shopping people bringing it during my stream. Gonna have to make sure that they don't have an 11 to 12 slot available. Okay, so there's our design. Now all we need to see is what you come up with. So you can do flowers and leaves are really simple for beginners to pick up because at the end of the day a leaf's going to look like a leaf no matter what shape it is. So you don't get hung up on it not looking leaf-like enough. Same with flowers. As long as you stick to the sort of doodle style flowers where that you're looking straight on, it's always going to look like a flower. So Sarah Lou, as you're late, this is the start of a kind of once a week, maybe once a fortnight project, so that we're going to actually build like a concertina that can go into our technique manual. And this is our first one, which is doodling. So we've done a little bit of work with the pencil tool, a little bit of work with the pen tool, and some work with the shape tools as well. Then I'm thinking the next one would be really nice to do something vintage, so that we can do some foiling, some leafing, I can't even say it. Okay, so I'm going to call it a day at that, and let's see what you come up with. Then once you've all had a go, I will show you how to export it and actually create it. So there's no stream tomorrow that is planned. I will say that way, that is planned. But we do still have the bucket to do, so keep an eye out on notifications for where we fit that into the slot, because that's going to definitely be a Ian required stream. So take care for now. Have a lovely Easter, and we will see you Tuesday 11 AM, if not before.